Hello, economic students. Hey, today we're going to talk about production and productivity and the way that we measure production and productivity. And when you get right down to it, this is important because it is our productivity that's the primary determinant of just how wealthy a society is. So let's get to it. How do we measure production? We measure it through something called gross domestic product, or GDP for short. And I have the definition here. GDP is the final value of all goods and services that are produced within a country in a year. Notice that the word final I have in bold and italics. You might want to underline that in your notes. And let me explain what this means. Let's say that I'm a farmer, and if I grow cotton, when I sell my cotton, that is not going to be a part of the GDP. If I sell my cotton to, say, a textile mill, that's not going to be included in the GDP. When the textile mill makes that cotton into cloth, they may sell it to someone like Nike. That's not going to be in GDP either. But when Nike takes that cloth and turns it into a t-shirt, and then it is given to a store to sell, at the point when it is sold at the store, that's when it becomes GDP. So the cotton goes through many processes, and it's only the final time that that cotton is sold as a finished product that it counts in the GDP. If we counted the cotton each time it was processed and sold at a different stage of production, we would be overstating our GDP. We only want to count it the last time that it is sold as a new product. GDP is composed of four things. Personal consumption. Personal consumption is what you and I would go to the store and buy. Personal consumption. It is also composed of investment. Now here's what I want you to understand. Investment, when we talk about GDP, is probably not what you think of when you think of investment. GDP investment is not buying stocks in the stock market. Investment in GDP means companies buying capital goods. Remember the factors of production: land, labor, capital. Capital goods are the machines that are used in the production of goods and services. That's capital. The buildings that companies have, that's capital. So investment refers to businesses buying machines and other things that they need to create the final product. GDP is also composed of government consumption. That is anything that any level of government spends its money on, whether it's roads, whether it's the military, whatever, government consumption. And finally, GDP is composed of net exports. And what that means is we take everything that we sell to consumers overseas, that's our exports, and then we subtract what we import from overseas. That is what we buy here in America that was actually made overseas. And there we get the net exports. Our exports minus imports equals net exports. In the past quite a few years, we've actually been importing more than we export as a nation. Therefore, net exports is usually, in recent years, a negative number because we import more than we export. Okay, so here's a graph that shows you GDP going all the way back to February of 1958, and you can see how the GDP has grown. I picked February 1958 because what I'm showing here is the GDP in my lifetime. I was born in February of 1958. So if you look at this graph, we start way down here and we end up way up here. That would imply that, by the way, where this graph ends is about 45 times greater than where it begins. So if I look at that, that means that we're producing 45 times more in dollar value than we produced when I was born. That implies that we're like 45 times richer here in America than we were when I was born, but that isn't true. Okay, we aren't making 45 times more stuff than we did when I was born. We aren't 45 times richer than we were when I was born. When I was born, my parents had a 3-bedroom home, just as I have today. My parents had 2 cars. I've got 2 cars at my house today. So we're not living 45 times better. So let's figure out what's going on here. There are some problems using GDP as I just defined it, measuring our economy over time. And the biggest of those problems is the fact that GDP, as I showed you a while ago, does not take into account a change in what things cost. And here I'm showing you in this graph the inflation rate since I was born in 1958. Something that cost $100 when I was born in February of 58 now costs over $900, approaching $1,000. So the inflation rate since I was born has raised prices roughly 900%. So obviously that's going to inflate GDP when things cost so much more than they did back then. So we have two ways that we can measure GDP. Nominal GDP is our production that's measured in current prices. That was the first graph that I showed you. Okay, GDP in current dollars. But if we want to factor the effect of inflation, we take real GDP. Real GDP adjusts for inflation. So two lines here. The top line is the line I showed you earlier. That's nominal GDP. And the red line is our real GDP. And you can see when you factor in inflation, that GDP growth is nowhere near what it was earlier. Okay, so let's see how we adjust for inflation. We use something called the GDP deflator. That's a price index that reduces current prices into prices of a base year. That's a fancy way of saying it. It's a way to factor in the effect of inflation. And here's the equation that we use to do this. We take our nominal GDP and then we divide it by the GDP deflator number. The current base year that we normally use to calculate the real GDP, that is GDP that's adjusted for inflation, is prices in the year 2012. So the GDP for deflator for 2012 would be 1.0. You would take the nominal GDP, divide it by 1. It's the same thing in 2012. However, we've had inflation since 2012, so the GDP deflator now is 1.174. So if I took our nominal GDP, divide it by 1.1741, that would get us our real GDP. The real GDP is usually less than the nominal GDP. So for example, right now the nominal GDP is somewhere in the neighborhood of $22.5 trillion. Real GDP is about $19.4 trillion. That factors in inflation. But there is another problem with GDP as a measure of our nation's production. And I'm going to go back to that slide that we had a second ago. This slide here showing real GDP, the number here ends about 6 times higher than it begins. So this would also imply that we're making 6 times more stuff today than we did back when I was born in February of 58. Or looking at it a different way, we should be 6 times wealthier today than we were in 1958. Still, I don't believe that's the case. Again, in 1958, my parents had 2 cars. I've got 2 cars. My parents had televisions. I've got televisions. My parents had, the 3-bedroom house, just as I do today. So, we're not living 6 times better than we did back then. So I think there's something else amiss here that we need to take account of. So let me get back up here. Well, let's think of some statistics here that might help us understand what still is missing. Nominal GDP in 1958 was $467 billion. That's using 2012 as our base year. Nominal GDP in in April of 2021 is 22.7 trillion. So there's been huge growth. That's nominal GDP. Real GDP in 1958, using 2012 prices, is $2.9 trillion. Real GDP today is $19.4 trillion. So again, you can see there's been significant growth. But here's what we need to remember. The population in 1958 was 177 million people. Population today, 330 million people. So real GDP is still overstating production somewhat because it's not taking into account changes in population. The GDP per person has not grown as much as GDP, just real GDP. So real GDP does not consider population changes. So if we want to consider population changes, we have to look at what we call real per capita GDP. That's the real GDP divided by the country's population. So I've added a third line that shows the changes in real per capita GDP. And this is the best way to measure how productive Americans, the change in productivity in America over the past 63 years since 1958. And this makes more sense. You can see where we start over here. If I'm starting at 100 in the far left, now I'm up to about 300 or so. So this tells me that we're actually producing about 3 times more than what we did when I was born. And I think that's probably true. Even though my family in 58 had 2 cars and I've got 2 cars today, the cars today are much, much better. Okay, so much of what we produce today is much, much better. We had a television in 1958. Well, in my house today, we've got 3 or 4 TVs, and they're much better TVs. Everything's better. The tires on my car are much better today. So real GDP is a good measurement, but real per capita GDP is a better measurement of just how productive individuals are and how well we are living. So there are some problems, though, with GDP, some shortcomings in using GDP as a measure of productivity, and there's 4 of them. And I'm going to address these 4, and then we'll be done with these notes. First of all, GDP does not measure the things that we produce but don't sell. So, for example, we have in this picture a soup kitchen. These people are not buying their dinner here. It's being given to them. This is production. We're producing something, but we're not selling it. This would not count towards GDP. That is a shortfall of using GDP to measure our productivity. It doesn't count productivity that is not sold. GDP does not count the productivity that we do ourselves within our home and consume ourselves. So here, for example, if I have a garden in my backyard, I'm producing goods, I'm producing food, but I'm consuming it myself. So that would not count towards GDP either, even though it is production. GDP does not measure the value of leisure time. So if I go put on my cross-country skis, go up to Rock Cut State Park, I don't pay any money to do that, and yet I'm getting value by that leisure time. If I choose to go camping and rest in a hammock like the gentleman on the left, there's value there. He's creating value with his leisure time, but it's not counted towards GDP because we can't put a monetary value on that. Now, if I go up to northern Wisconsin to a ski resort and pay money to go skiing up there, then it would count towards GDP, but not if I just go out to the golf course or to the state park here in Rockford where I don't pay anything. And finally, GDP doesn't count the value of illegal production or the underground economy. So sadly, there's a lot of production that is illegal, the production of narcotics that you see here, or illegal whiskey on the left. That is not going to be included in GDP, even though it is production. There is value there, and sadly, people will pay a lot of money for that illegal production, but that's not going to be counted in the GDP. So the best tool that we have to measure our productivity and our wealth as a society is our GDP, and the best tool to measure wealth of individuals is the real per capita GDP, but it is not a perfect measurement of the wealth of a nation or the productivity of a nation. So with that, I'm going to close this presentation. I know I went very, very fast, so you might want to rewind and kind of hear again what I've covered and make sure that you get all of this information in your notes. It's going to be very, very important that you understand this information as we move forward for the rest of the semester. And also keep in mind that word investment and what investment means, one of the 4 things that count towards GDP. And with that, have a great day, and we will talk to you later.